Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Murray Sabrin about the results of the November 2016 election, reactions to Donald Trump being elected, Donald Trump's presidency so far, and what to expect from Donald Trump's administration in the coming years. Murray is professor of finance in the Anisfield School of Business at Ramapo College of New Jersey. He was the Libertarian Party's nominee for governor of New Jersey in 1997, and he sought the Republican Party's nomination for U.S. Senate races in 2000, 2008, and 2014. You can follow his work at murraysabrin.com. You can find him on Facebook under Murray Sabrin. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/2016-election. Murray, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure being with you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So we obviously have a lot to cover in this conversation, and I first want to start off by going back to November and taking a look at what happened in the elections themselves, because I think the results came as a surprise to a lot of people, and there are some conclusions that maybe we can draw from those elections that a lot of people were not expecting to draw. So let's just start there. What do the results from November mean, and how should what we saw on Election Day, what we saw during the early voting period, both in terms of the presidential race and some of the other races, how should those results be interpreted?
Well, I think there are several takeaways from the election. One is the Clinton people counted their chickens before they hatched, so to speak. They thought that this was a shoo-in, that this was in the bag, that Trump was either a clown or such an evil person, misogynist, homophobe, anti-Muslim, that there's no way this guy could win the election. But what Trump did was run the most unorthodox presidential campaign in my lifetime, and probably in American history, where he spent a fraction of what the Clinton campaign did. They spent $1.5 billion. I think Trump spent maybe $200-300 million if he spent that much. I don't know what the final numbers were. I haven't looked at the Federal Election Commission reports, but he was sucking up all the oxygen in terms of media from the primary through the general election. So he was on the news every night for a few minutes, and those were his commercials in effect, rather than having to. I don't think I ever saw a commercial of Trump on TV. If I did, it was so infrequently, I don't even remember it. I saw a few Hillary Clinton commercials in New York metropolitan area because I live in New Jersey, and New York and New Jersey went heavily for Clinton, so she didn't have to advertise much here. But what Trump did was tap into the anxiety of the average blue-collar working individual in America who's seen their standard of living decline, who's seen their jobs disappear. And so he was brilliant in terms of figuring out what's wrong with the American political system, and he ran a totally populist anti-Washington campaign. So from that perspective, he knew before the pollsters knew, before the pundits knew, that what was bothering the American people, and he was able to capture the imagination, if you want to use that term, of why people were going to go to him instead of Hillary Clinton, who thought that she was just going to have run almost a front porch campaign where she would have surrogates go all over the country for her, and she would campaign as infrequently as possible, and that there's no way they thought that he was going to win. But he surprised everybody. I must say, a week before the election, I was on a radio show talking about the election on Halloween of all day, and I said Trump's going to win. Not that I had any brilliant insight, but the feel of the campaign was that his momentum was building, even though I didn't look at the actual poll results from the states that supposedly were going to be in the Hillary column, like Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin, like Michigan. And those states were supposed to be blue states, but Trump won those states, and that put him over the top.
Yeah, he did a tremendous job of speaking, especially to working class voters in those states. And the polling in Michigan, of course, during the primaries was completely off. Bernie Sanders won the primary there, and yet none of the polls showed him close there. So I don't know if the pollsters were using faulty logic, or if they just don't know how to poll these states, or if they were deceptive in their polling methods. I don't know what happened there, but it did seem like the momentum and the tenor of the campaign and the style that under which Donald Trump was campaigning, it did seem like those would be very effective and that he would have a good chance at winning despite what the mainstream media was saying. But you're right that his style of campaigning and the way this campaign played out is very different than what we've seen. So do you think we're going to see this style of campaigning used more? Is this going to be, are we going to see changes in the way these campaigns are conducted? Or is this just a one-time thing with someone with tremendous fame, tremendous wealth, and a very unique personality?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. He had fame, name recognition, and personality, and those are irresistible to a large swath of the American voters. I mean, he didn't go detail into policy. He just had a thematic campaign of Make America Great Again and Drain the Swamp. And that was basically his campaign. It was somewhat reminiscent of Clinton's 1992 campaign when he beat George Bush in Perot, where he said, it's the economy, stupid. And even though the economy was recovering from the 1991 recession, Clinton was able to tap in the angst that was around at that time. So Trump had his finger on the pulse, and he didn't need any high-powered political consultants who usually tell you wrong things anyway. And he was able to capture the Republican nomination when no one thought he had a chance. I think when he announced, he was, I think, at 2% in the polls. And after the first debate, he skyrocketed because he sounded like the average worker. I mean, he comes from New York. He has that swagger from New York. He's been around a long time, being in the real estate business as a youngster, learning the business from his father. So he's been in the business world for virtually all of his life. And so, and his celebrity status being on TV and his books and whatever. So he has the type of personality that's very hard to replicate in the future. I mean, a 3 times married individual who was getting support from the religious right. So go figure how in America there are strange bedfellows or coalitions that you can make in a campaign. But he knew exactly what to do, namely make his opponents in the Republican primary seem small while he loomed large. And it also helps to be tall. I mean, that's one of the other things. Being tall is very helpful in a presidential campaign because it just exudes confidence. It exudes, if you will, authority. And I think that a large number of people were looking for that in a candidate this year or last year.
Yeah, although Jeb Bush's height didn't seem to help him out too much.
Well, that's why personality is important.
Right. Yeah, you need the right combination of all those factors working together. But beyond Donald Trump's victory, we also saw somewhat sweeping victories for Republican Party candidates across the board. The Republican Party maintained control of the Senate, maintained control of the House, picked up some governorships. It's now at the point where 4 of the 6 governors in New England are Republicans, which is sort of an incredible thing to think about. We saw in local races, in state races, all across the board, the Republican Party and their candidates being very successful. So was this a lot of this just riding the coattails of the populist, drain the swamp, anti-Washington, anti-establishment campaign of Donald Trump? Or is there something else that we should read into this? Because it seems strange that someone who's as anti-Washington as Trump would get elected, and yet you would see in Washington insiders and incumbents, someone like a Blunt in Missouri or Rob Portman in Ohio, get reelected as well. So how do you reconcile those things with each other?
Well, as someone said years ago, all politics is local, and when you have local races, it's really the dynamics of the local environment, the local political structure, and tapping into your constituents as much as possible to see what their concerns are. And most people quote their congressman. If you do a poll, I think people say they're very happy with their local congressman, whether it's a Democrat or Republican. So you have a 95% reelection rate in the House of Representatives. I mean, this is Soviet-style politics, if you will, where virtually it's very difficult to defeat an incumbent, especially one that's been there a long time. In Senate races, you have more dynamics because you can get turnover. You do have states where you have a Republican and a Democrat, but most states either have all Republicans or all Democrats. So again, the political map of this country is very interesting. That the House is solidly Republican. I don't know what it would take for the Democrats to win over the House of Representatives. What is it now? The Republicans have, I think, a 40-seat majority, if I'm not mistaken. Is it something?
It's somewhere in that ballpark. I don't know the exact number.
So you got to turn over at least 20 seats for the Democrats to take back the House. Now, that could happen in 2018 if the next 2 years are a disaster for the Trump administration, and people will go to the polls, and the Democrats will say, "See, we told you so. There's a crazy guy in the White House, so we need to have more checks and balances. So we need to elect a Democratic Congress, especially a House, to make sure that the country doesn't go off the rails under President Trump." But no one knows what the future will be. We can see in the first 12 days of the Trump administration, there are some signs from a libertarian perspective that are problematic, with a lot of executive orders that may not be moving the country in the direction we would like to see of limited government and more free enterprise. Instead, Trump seems to me that he thinks he's the CEO of the American economy, and that he can order companies around and do things like that. That's very troublesome for libertarians, that the president is not the CEO whose job it is to allocate resources in our economy. That's the job of entrepreneurs, and he should know that better than anyone else. No one told him how to build hotels or where to build them or who to hire. And so I find that so far, one of the most troubling things about his administration is that he thinks his job is to increase manufacturing employment. That's not the job of the president. The job of the president is to secure our borders and maintain a free enterprise economy, which means reducing taxes, getting rid of unnecessary regulations, and there are a lot of those, and trying to do something about the Federal Reserve, which he did mention during the campaign, that the Federal Reserve is politicized and it's creating another bubble.
Right, and there does seem to be some movement from this administration towards getting rid of at least some regulations. I haven't heard anything from him or anyone in his administration about the Federal Reserve since he was sworn in as president, but I don't know, maybe that will happen. He did talk about auditing the Fed during the campaign, and he did point out that the Federal Reserve is largely a political institution and acts accordingly with its policies. But one thing that should be very scary from a libertarian perspective about what we've seen from Donald Trump so far since he's been in office is much of the foreign policy rhetoric and the foreign policy actions, where we see this very harsh rhetoric towards Iran, towards China. We see talk of safe zones in Syria and in Yemen. He even had some, I guess, somewhat minor comments about sending troops into Mexico, which I assume that that's not going to happen. There's no truth to that, but they're just the rhetoric coming from this administration and the foreign policy realm is very scary, even though during the primaries he did say some things regarding foreign policy that were better than Hillary Clinton and many of his Republican primary opponents at various times.
Yeah, Adam, there's no question about it. Some of the statements he's made so far is really frightening in terms of, are we going to have more peace in the world, or is he going to be using the military to achieve some objectives that he has? He has said some nice things about having peace with Russia, which is very important since they are a nuclear power. But the whole Middle East, which he did say during the campaign, has been a disaster. So if our intervention in the Mideast has been a disaster, the conclusion should be it's not our role in the Mideast to try to figure out who are the good guys and the bad guys. Let them figure it out themselves. And Russia has a major interest in that part of the world since they border the Middle East. So you would think that Trump would say to Putin, this is your backyard. You can take care of the issues there because it's in your national interest to make sure there's peace on your border. And he should say, we've tried intervening in the Mideast. Or not tried. We have intervened in the Mideast. It hasn't worked. It's cost us $5 trillion, all of which has been borrowed. We've lost thousands and thousands of men in combat and to horrendous injuries, and hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians have perished. So if he really has a humanitarian streak, which I think he does, he would say, get with his advisors and make a major policy address that it's not up to the United States government and the American people's resources to make the world safe for democracy in the Mideast. We've tried that policy for more than 20 years with the first invasion of the Mideast during Desert Storm that got us involved in Iraq, then the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's been a total failure. This is the greatest military failure in U.S. history. We've been in Afghanistan for 15 years, and we need to withdraw as quickly as possible and do what Trump says he wants to do, is rebuild the infrastructure. I don't know how much it needs to be done, but whatever needs to be done should be done. And we should lower taxes and reduce the military budget. Instead, there are indications he wants to increase the size of the military, spend more money, but do it more efficiently. And the last thing we need is a bigger military.
Right, and yet he did use a lot of America First type rhetoric on the campaign trail. Even just recently in his inaugural address, he used the phrase America First, and everyone on ABC, which is the network where I was watching his speech, everyone on there was just freaking out. How dare he use that language? But he does seem to have some America First instincts, and some instincts that lead away from intervening in the Middle East and away from nation building and away from all of these massive interventions. And yet he's surrounded by people who in large part seem to be very much in favor of these interventions. And his policies so far, albeit in a very short time period, don't seem to suggest that he necessarily is going to stick to this America First rhetoric that he used so frequently on the campaign trail. So we'll see. I mean, it could be better, but there's also some reason to believe it could be worse too.
Well, what could happen is if he does decide to confront Iran, given that he's recently said there may be more sanctions on Iran, and if the stock market tanks, that could frighten him to get involved in a military confrontation. And then if you've got North Korea out there also, you have an individual that's running the show there that who knows what his thoughts are about Trump. But you've got so many potential tripwires around the world that these are the chickens coming home to roost of interventionism. And while libertarians have been in the forefront, no matter who's in office, a Republican or Democrat, that interventionism is counterproductive, it's immoral, it's anti-humanitarian, it's anti-sound finance. All the bad things you associate with government coalesce in interventionism because it's very costly from not only a financial point of view, but a humanitarian point of view. So there's nothing good to say about this militarism, this military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell address in 1961. So I hope Trump read his farewell address. He read a lot of inaugural addresses, but he should also have read Eisenhower's farewell address, who was a military man all his life and then became president and was frightened of having another war. We had World War II, we had Korea, and we had the beginnings of Vietnam under Eisenhower. And so I was speaking to a political observer in New Jersey the other day, and I believe that the Vietnam War was probably the most important event in my lifetime because it corrupted so much about American society, and that the notion of interventionism has been with us since then. Well, actually, since the end of World War II with Korea, Vietnam. But Vietnam, for those of us baby boomers who grew up, who were in college during Vietnam, it was one of the defining episodes of our life, and it had so much impact on people's lives, careers, what have you. And it just gave the notion, or just made the notion, that the government can continue to intervene overseas and have good results. And here was one of the poorest countries in the world that we intervened in. And the lesson should have been, let people around the world settle their own affairs and find their own way in the world. And if that lesson, unfortunately, has not been learned by both Republicans and Democrats.
Sure. Now let's turn our attention back to this theme of populism and the anti-establishment message that Trump spoke of on the campaign trail, and even recently in his inaugural address he spoke of it, and continues to speak of it to some degree. How much of this do you think we'll see during his time of office? How much of a drain the swamp type of administration are we going to see? Because some of his appointments, appointing people with close ties to Goldman Sachs, appointing people who have been around Washington for a long time, and some of his actions so far do lead to some skepticism that we're actually going to see the swamp be drained. So what do you think we're going to see during the coming years as far as the draining of the swamp, and as far as his populist message turning into action, or a lack of action in some cases, during his administration?
Yeah, I'm not optimistic, Adam, for the simple reason I've seen enough presidents in my lifetime do the opposite of what they said they were going to do during their campaign. I don't think he's going to be draining the swamp at all. I think he's basically going to do what other presidents have done, is either expand the welfare warfare state or maintain the status quo. Listen, we have Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, a military-industrial complex, regulations across the board, intervention in the workplace by the government. We have a Department of Energy and Education that Reagan campaigned on to abolish. They're still around. And you have Rick Perry, the new Secretary of Energy, saying he doesn't want to abolish it, even though he said he was going to do that. He wanted to do that when he was a presidential candidate. So I'm not optimistic. Things are so entrenched in Washington, D.C., it's going to take, unfortunately, I think, a Greek-style debt crisis to change the culture in Washington. And even that, I'm not confident will get us toward a more libertarian society, because what could happen is then the Bernie Sanders of the world will say, we told you so. Capitalism doesn't work. We need to get more toward a single-payer healthcare system. We need to have more taxes on the wealthy and the middle class to pay for this big welfare state. And so I'm not confident that Trump has that in mind, because he doesn't have a coherent philosophical foundation. That's what I observed during the primary and during the presidential election. He just used a lot of sound bites and made statements that appealed to people who were the Reagan Democrats back in 1980. He brought them in, and that's why he won the way he did. So if I were to guess, let's say we do get corporate tax reductions, which would be extremely helpful to the economy. Let's say we get individual tax cuts. That still leaves open the question, what's going to happen to spending? Because it's two sides of the coin. You have taxes on one side, you have spending on the other. If the deficit explodes, this is where we could see the dollar possibly being under pressure overseas. And that's why I think we'll see we could see the stock market have a big rally because of all the spending, but then the day of reckoning will come, and we could have bubble three. We had the dot-com bubble, we had the housing bubble, and now we'll have the Yellen bubble, and this could come crashing down somewhere in Trump's term.
So how do you anticipate his administration being different from previous administrations? Because his campaigning style was definitely different, and his rhetoric is different, and the perception seems to be that he's going to be much different. So in what ways will he actually be different?
Well, I think he's going to be more, hyper, if you want to use that term. I mean, look at all the things he's doing on a day-to-day basis. The question is, what legislation will be introduced? I just read recently that House Speaker Ryan said that tax reform or tax cuts and repealing Obamacare won't happen until the spring. Well, that's 6-8 weeks away. But now the Republicans are getting a little bit nervous that they don't want to repeal and replace. They want to repeal and repair. That's not a libertarian proposal, even though the Republicans have been voting to repeal Obamacare when they were in the minority. Now they're in the majority. It seems that they're getting cold feet to just repeal Obamacare, and let's come up with some free market solutions to healthcare, as opposed to this top-down approach, this trickle-down healthcare approach where the government sets standards, creates mandates, provides subsidies. These are things that are the antithesis of a libertarian society, the antithesis of having a strong doctor-patient relationship. And so we need to go back to the drawing board, and we know what works. Freedom works. That's the bottom line. And I'll be writing about this in the book that I'll be working on over the summer and into the fall, about how to replace the welfare state and go back to the old days of local charities and voluntarism, things that really are the foundation of the American social sector, as opposed to this monstrosity called the welfare state.
Yeah, and I definitely want to ask you more about your book in a little bit. But on the subject of Republicans getting cold feet about repealing Obamacare, we have seen before that when Republicans are out of power, or they're only in power in certain areas but not enough to really change much, that they talk a good game, but then when they're in power across the board, as we saw during a portion of the George W. Bush administration, controlling the White House and both houses of Congress, that their actions and the legislation that they pass doesn't necessarily fit in with the limited government rhetoric that many of them use to get elected, and that many of them use on the campaign trail. So we have seen this before, and I guess it's not particularly surprising that they might be getting cold feet.
Well, 20 years ago, when I was the Libertarian Party nominee for governor in New Jersey, I spoke at Rutgers University to a political science class, and I gave a half-hour, 45-minute talk on what a libertarian New Jersey would look like. And one student raised his hands during the Q&A and said, "Dr. Sabrin, you say you believe in personal responsibility, limited government, and free enterprise. What makes you different than a Republican?" I said, "I mean it." And so that is what brought down the House, because as you correctly pointed out, Republicans talk a good game of free enterprise and limited government, but when they govern no different than a Democrat. We've seen it here in New Jersey with Chris Christie. We've seen it in other states where Republicans basically become caretakers for what the Democrats have implemented before they got into office. And I've been in New Jersey 40 years, and this is what happened when Republicans have captured the governor's mansion. They govern like a Democrat.
Sure. Now, returning to the subject of how Trump has been different and might be different than his predecessors, one area where he was very different on the campaign trail is the way he went after the mainstream media. Now, we've seen Republican candidates go after the mainstream media before. We saw Newt Gingrich do it, Ted Cruz. But Trump was almost relentless with going after the media, with denigrating the media. And even since being elected, he's continued to go after the media. So is this something that we should expect to see? And how significant is it that he's going after large portions of the mainstream media?
Well, I think that's one of his tactics, is to make sure that the media get called on the carpet from his perspective of how they report the news. Because having run for office, I see how reporters will interview you and you tell them one thing, and what gets reported is a little bit different than what you say in the paper. So I think he has a case to be made that reporters are supposed to be objective chroniclers of the day's events, but in fact they have their own biases. There's no question about it. Was it 90% of the media usually vote Democratic? So you have a built-in bias of their views of the world. And when they go to journalism school, what do they learn? They learn about the prevailing culture, which is statism and interventionism, and that's the way they filter the information that they get from candidates, and they present it to the public in a way that makes the candidate, who's either a fiscal conservative, a social conservative, a cultural conservative, or a libertarian, quote, out of the mainstream. And that's the way they present it to the American people. And then people who are the deplorables, the term that Hillary Clinton used, they find this offensive, and they know that the media are not telling the truth about the issues of the day. So Trump is using a tactic that is going to gin up his base, and they're going to be behind him no matter what he says. I think any other candidate, given what Trump said in October that was revealed from years ago about grabbing women's private parts, would have sunk any other candidate. But he not only survived it, but I think he got more support afterwards.
No, he may very well have. And of course, it set up quite the debate afterwards that I know many in the mainstream media think he lost that debate, but it may have helped him, help catapult him to victory to put on that display in front of such a large audience. But one thing that has definitely been considered to be outside of the mainstream that we've seen in Trump's presidency so far is some of his immigration policy. And of course, he focused on immigration to great lengths on the campaign trail, talking about building a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border and having Mexico pay for it, talking about not letting refugees in, or at least reducing the number of refugees that would be let in. So one promise, I guess we could say, that he's kept so far is addressing immigration policy to some degree, and we've seen massive uproar and protest towards his recent executive orders regarding individuals from 7 countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and what should be done about those individuals being able to come to the U.S., whether it be as refugees or otherwise. So what should we make of what we've seen with Trump's immigration policy so far, and with the reaction as well to Trump's immigration edicts?
Yeah, this is another example of how things get blown out of proportion. I mean, he's essentially continuing what Obama started, from what I've been reading, that Obama cited these 7 countries as, or people from those 7 countries as potential terrorists. And so therefore, Trump, said, okay, we're just going to have a moratorium for 3 months on people coming in from those countries, or at least vetting them very, very carefully. So this has caused a great stir, as we've seen across the country. And I think people are missing the point that he made. It was not presented in the best of circumstances. He could have said, listen, President Obama said this. I think it's time we continue that policy just for the security of the American people. And I think he would have been okay. But when you roll things out in a fashion that does not explain what you're doing, people get very upset. And so he's got this to contend with. But immigration has become one of the most important issues facing the country from a political point of view. But there's a simple way of handling the problem of immigration. We can just discuss it very briefly. All he has to say is, if you didn't come in here by the rules established by our country, you cannot become a citizen. In other words, there'll be no amnesty, and that we're not going to deport you unless you commit a crime. If you're here and you're working and you're not being a burden, in other words, no welfare if you come here illegally. There's no government benefits for you if you come here illegally, paid for by the taxpayers. I think that will quell a lot of the problems in the country. But the Democrats want to have open immigration because they think that's more voters for them. So Trump has to come up with a coherent, comprehensive statement about what immigration policy should be and how to deal with the undocumented people that are here, that will not cause strain in families, because the last thing you want to do, I think, is to break up families where you send back the parents and the children who were born here. And he can make the statement, hey, children are not responsible for their decision to come here, but by the same token, a birthright citizenship is not what we're all about. So that's a big controversial issue in and of itself. But he started out with probably the most contentious issue that's facing the country, and he rolled it out in a very clumsy way. I think if he did a little bit better, it would have, I think, downplayed the conflict that we're now seeing across the country.
Sure, and let's talk about the conflict that we're seeing across the country, not just as pertains to this immigration issue, but just in general, because we've seen a lot of very strong reactions from large numbers of people to Donald Trump being elected. We saw immediately after his election, the very next day, protests and marches in numerous cities across the U.S. After he was inaugurated, the day after, we saw this women's march in Washington, and then similar protests and marches in other cities. We've seen these protests to his immigration policies so far, and the demonstrations at airports. So what should we make of this reaction, especially from the left, to Donald Trump being elected, and all the scores of protests and marches and demonstrations that we've seen that seem largely to be speaking out against his being president?
Well, one thing we should know about the left, and I just posted this on my blog, is that the left is relentless in their achieving their goals of statism. That's what they want. They want more government control. And yet here's somebody that is, from the critics' perspective, seems like an authoritarian. I think some libertarians would agree with that also. And therefore, they don't like it when he's doing things that they oppose. So even though they like a strong presidency, they don't like a strong presidency when he's doing things that they don't agree with. So again, here's another example of the chickens coming home to roost. And that's why libertarians are so insightful about this. We should not have a strong presidency. We should have a decentralized government. And so the people on the left, they're going to keep on marching. They're going to keep on demonstrating. Some of these people are paid to do this because they want to make sure that the Trump administration is defeated in every single way with his new Supreme Court nominee. Apparently will be voted against by virtually all the Democrats. Maybe there'll be some Democrats that'll vote for him and he'll get through. But you got to understand, the left really doesn't like anything that's going to upset their apple cart, which is what? Bigger and bigger government, more and more taxes, more and more spending, more and more regulation. If they see Trump as a threat to that, they are going to continue to demonstrate. And I'm afraid it's going to get more violent as time goes on.
Yeah, and supposedly the left takes on an anti-war position, an anti-interventionist position, although we don't usually see that actually play out, and we haven't seen any reaction to the left from Trump's moves to intervene with safe zones in Syria and Yemen, and the saber rattling towards Iran and elsewhere. So although we see leftist protests in many areas, we don't see it in those areas. But before we wrap up, I do want to talk about that Supreme Court nominee, and you just raised that topic, of course, but one of the reasons that many brought up for supporting Trump was that whoever he was going to nominate to the Supreme Court would be better than whoever Hillary Clinton potentially would nominate. So how significant is his nomination to the Supreme Court moving forward, and should we be optimistic about Neil Gorsuch, or is it too early to tell?
Well, as you know, one of the things that Republicans always say is that we have to elect a Republican president because the Republican president is going to put really good people on the Supreme Court. Well, look what happened with George W.H. Bush. He put on Souter, who was a disaster for the court. Roberts was the deciding vote on Obamacare. He was appointed by Bush too. And so I'm not optimistic that the Supreme Court's going to be our savior. I think what's going to have to happen is people like yourself and others who have access to the internet to get people involved in not so much the political process, but speaking out and changing the hearts and minds of people through lectures, through books, through writings, through radio interviews, whatever, because I think we've seen in the political process, there's a tremendous inertia to get things changed in a more libertarian direction. I think that's my basic conclusion, having been involved in political campaigns and observed people like Reagan, who came in, I think, with the great intentions to change the system in Washington. He got totally co-opted. So I think what we need to do is just watch what Trump does. If he does something that we can applaud, let's do it. If he does things that are really harmful to freedom, ideas, and liberty, we should castigate him. And we should just try to live our lives to be as productive as possible. And hopefully government one day won't be as important in our lives as it is today.
Yeah, let's hope that's the case. And on the subject of Republican presidents not always appointing the best judges, Anthony Kennedy was a Reagan appointee. So there's yet another example. But before we wrap up and before we talk about your book a little bit more, one final question. Do you have any predictions of how all this will turn out? And are there any reasons for libertarians to be optimistic based on what we've seen so far and based on what we should expect to happen in the coming years? As far as Trump's administration goes.
Well, the thing that concerns me is that we have another bubble that being inflated, and it's been inflated since 2009 when the last bubble burst. And so we're going to have another bursting of a bubble. And so the question is, what will be the reaction of Trump? From my perspective, doing as much reading as I can and an analysis of the data, it looks like the bubble is going to burst in 2018, 2019. And we'll have to wait to see what happens when the house of cards starts to fall in a couple of years. So if Trump does another Bush and Obama and the Federal Reserve floods the economy with money, we could be in real big trouble by the end of his first term. And the question is, does that mean he'll be a one-term president? That's a real possibility. The question is, he's got to do something that libertarians will applaud over the next 3 to 6 months, certainly by the end of this year. So we can see that he's sincere about draining the swamp. If he doesn't drain the swamp or begin to drain the swamp this year, I think his presidency will just be another status quo presidency.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for joining me and for being so generous with your time today. What are the best ways to follow your work? And then can you talk a little bit more about your book and any other projects that you're working on that you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, I'm on. I have a blog, murraysabrin.com, and I blog every day. Some not too many original pieces now because I'm on sabbatical writing a book on financial bubbles. So I've been reading a lot for the past 6 weeks since I've been on sabbatical, and then I'll be working on another book starting in the summer, and it's got a nice title. It's sort of contra Bernie Sanders. It's called The Next Revolution: Personal Social Responsibility and Financial Independence. And this is where I challenge the whole notion of a welfare state and how things could be done better in the nonprofit sector, as opposed to having this multi-trillion-dollar welfare state across the country trying to help people. I think if people want to help people, there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. The right way is the nonprofit sector and philanthropy. The wrong way to do it is through the welfare state.
Well, great. And what is the title of the other book that you're working on, and what's that one about?
Well, the working title is Interest Rates, Prices, and Production, The Quest for Sustainable Prosperity. And I may change the title. That's sort of a working title. I think I may change the title to Greenspan, Bernanke, and Who Else Knew That the Bubbles Were Coming?
Well, that sounds great. That title would definitely make it a must-read in and of itself, but I'm sure it'll be wonderful reading and a very important book, regardless of what the title says. So that's great, and good luck with your projects and your books, and thank you so much for joining me today. I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/2016-election. So that's going to be the place to go to find links and resources related to this episode. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/2016-election. And I want to encourage everybody to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher so you can get all the episodes and stay up to date and not miss any. And again, Murray, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today and for taking a look at what we saw last November and what we've seen since and what we might be able to expect from the Trump administration. So thank you so much, and hopefully we can talk again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Adam, for the opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.